In today's episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast, we are joined by Dan Favale to talk about the Pistons offseason, their young core, and what does Cade have to do this upcoming season to have a successful season. We'll talk about that in today's episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast.
You are Locked On Pistons, your daily Detroit Pistons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons, hit that subscribe button, or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. You'll hear more about FanDuel a little later. I actually forgot to introduce myself. I'm Kuka Hill, your daily host every single day per usual. But we are joined today by Dan Favale of Bleacher Report. You can follow him on Twitter at Dan Favale. Also, subscribe to his podcast, Hardwood Knocks. Thank you, Dan, for coming on, man. How you doing today?
I'm doing well, Ku. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, man. I'm excited today to talk about everything we have going on. I'm also kind of excited to get onto this new 2K25 after we're done and look at the Pistons roster. So I'm having a fun day. I'm having a good day. So
you try to play some go-karting on 2K? Is that what
I haven't. I've seen a lot of the new little features, and we'll see how it is. But all right. So on today's podcast, we'll talk about the Pistons. Like I said in the cold open, we'll talk about the Pistons offseason. We'll talk about the Pistons young core, and also I want to get Dan's thoughts on what does Cade have to do to kind of get national respect and what he has to do this year to really take that next step forward. But let's go ahead and start off with the Pistons offseason. So, Dan, I just want to tell you where I am on the Pistons offseason and why I'm so interested to hear your thoughts on it. Because as the Pistons offseason was playing out, I thought that, okay, I don't think it was a great offseason, but I don't think it was a bad offseason. I was more so like, okay, I get what they're doing. And if based on what I believe their goal was, I was like, okay, they seem to have, achieved what their goal was trying to do. But as time has went on, I've listened and watched and read a lot of people outside Detroit's work and what they think about the Pistons offseason. And I haven't really seen anyone think it was good at all. I've seen almost everyone say it was pretty bad, actually. So it had me, kind of reevaluate my stance. Like, okay, am I not seeing what makes it so bad? So I want to hear from your perspective. What did you think about the Pistons offseason?
I think I view it more neutrally. If anything, I think it was, good in the sense that they have an easier path to better spacing around Cade Cunningham consistently. To get Malik Beasley, you bring back Simone Fontecchio. Tobias Harris's first team. I wish that guy shot more threes, but he's a capable shooter. Tim Hardaway Jr., for what Tim Hardaway Jr. is, you're going to pull your hair out. But at the same time, that's another guy who should, compared to last season, yes, had, kind of peaks and valleys, mostly valleys with him. But that's someone who's hit threes consistently. And so as someone, based off what I've seen from the Pistons over the past couple of years, I just want as much spacing on the floor around Cade and then whatever big they decide to play as possible. If that's the mission, without sort of compromising your long-term, and I think most importantly, infringing upon the development of any one prospect by having guys who need the ball, I think you, for the most part, did that. You could maybe quibble over, which I know we did on Hardwood Knocks. Did they act a little early when it came to that Tim Hardaway Jr. Salary dump trade when they absorbed him? Sure. But I don't know that this was like a massive L of an offseason. I think if anyone's kind of gone that route, they're either one, expecting Detroit to make huge swings with their cap space, or two, they kind of just have PTSD from last offseason and everything that happened going from Monty Williams to ending up with JB Bickerstaff.
So I'll go ahead and say this. Before the offseason started, I was more so one of the people within the Pistons community that talked about wanting the team to make some bigger moves, to maybe move on from some of the young guys, maybe go and make some trades, maybe try to get in some bigger contract, bigger name players to put next to Cade Cunningham, because Cade showed that I thought he showed last year that he was ready to be, try to be on a good team for the Pistons, try to lead a good team. Obviously they didn't do that, but I was one of the people who would have been okay with that route. If you were the GM of the Pistons, is this the route you would have taken? Would you have taken the same route that Trajan Langdon took, or would you have been more aggressive with the cap space, with your young assets that you do have? What route would you have taken?
I might have been, would I've done the Tim Hardaway Jr. trade? No, especially if it's not if it's costing me Quentin Grimes. Would I have been more aggressive? If you're looking at maybe free agents who ended up taking like less elsewhere, you think that you could have overpaid them and they would have fit that motif of keeping us maneuverable for the future, but also like giving us better spacing. I think you could have gone that route, but I think people would also have to point to me, to you, to us and say, what opportunity did the Pistons actively pass on? And when I look at how this offseason unfolded, I don't know that I see this can't miss free agent or can't miss move that they weren't able to pull off. And so I think that context, at least to me, seems super important. So would I've gone about like certain things differently? Like I might have just had Gary Trent Jr. on this team because of the value if he was willing to come. But like if we're talking about Gary Trent Jr. and like Tim Hardaway Jr., we're kind of at a point where we're splitting hairs over it. So yeah, I would have done things a little differently, but I don't view it as a miss. And the other thing I'm interested that you said you might consider moving some of the younger guys. And I think it's very clear they all don't complement one another. But when you look at how Ausar Thompson's season ended with the blood clots, and I also consider him just a core piece of this team. If you were looking at Jaden Ivey specifically, you're moving him then at the nadir of his value. And so even though he's not this front office's guy, I do understand the impetus to, well, one, let's see if he can fit if he's outside this head coach's doghouse, or two, can we rehab his value a little bit and then move on from him that way?
So where I really want to take this to next is, do you think Pistons fans, who obviously this past year for the Pistons was the worst in franchise history, they were on like a massive losing streak, tied the longest losing streak across 2 seasons. They were the longest losing streak within 1 season. That losing streak was so bad, by the way, at one point I was getting called by like European radio stations to come do like interviews live, like in Europe. And I'm like, this is a national, like the Pistons are a national embarrassment right now. Like everyone somehow cares about this. So that last season was so terrible. Over the last 4 years, really has been one of the worst like stretches in NBA history over the last 4 or 5 years for the Pistons. The fan base has not seen a lot of wins. They have not seen a lot of good basketball. They haven't seen a lot of things to be excited about. It seems like, and like you've said, and I've said this on the podcast a few times as well, that Trajan Langdon, the new president of basketball operations, went the route of, I'm going to get spacing to give these young guys a chance to show me that what they could do with spacing, because they didn't have it last year. So before I make any final decisions, I'll give them spacing. Let's give them until around the trade deadline, I believe is what his goal is. Let's see what they look like. Do they look better with spacing? Do they improve? If not, we'll move on. If so, okay, maybe we have something. So it is more of a patient route, I would say. A little bit more of a safer route, I guess I would say, by Trajan. Do you think Pistons fans who have sat through what they've sat through, do you think that is, because I see it being a mixed response in the community so far. I've seen a lot of people like, okay, we love it. We want to see Jaden Ivey get better. We want to see Duran get better. Believe in these guys. And then there's some other people that are like, look, Cade was pretty good this past year. We've seen enough losing. Cade's ready. Why didn't we try to do more? So where do you think Pistons fans should stand based off this offseason?
If you have to pick one end of the spectrum, I would personally, as a fan, and I know Detroit fans have been through a lot, so bless all of them that they've had to sit through all of this, but you should be happy that they weren't more aggressive, because you know what happens when you're more aggressive in an offseason like this? You end up like the Chicago Bulls, where you're like kind of mortgaging part of your future, or you're not good enough to play any meaningful games, but you're also not bad enough to get the perks that come with being actually bad, which was mostly just the draft picks, or a front office that's thinking along the lines of, oh, we will, like, at least the Tim Hardaway Jr. trade, well, I wouldn't have made it. At least it kind of showed, right, this front office is willing to take on undesirable money if it's attached to some type of asset, and they're willing to use their flexibility, that way. And so that's more where I would lean toward, because I understand that organizational existences aren't binary. It's not championship or you need to be awful, but you don't want to be caught in the sub middle. And so I would just reiterate that if there are Pistons fans that are aggravated with this offseason, I would just be curious as to what are the moves? What are the things that you would have done within reason? Like, you can't sit here and say like, well, they should have just traded for Devin Booker or something, because that's not realistic. I want to know what the plausible moves were that would have put this team in a position to be a lot better both now and later. And so when it's framed that way, I'll take more of a net neutral or a slightly positive offseason over going for that home run swing.
Yeah, I think neutral is exactly where I've been at, but seeing as many people nationally really feel like much lower than that on the team, I've kind of tried to like reevaluate. Okay, am I a little too high on this? Am I looking at it with a little bit more biased eyes here? So it's interesting to hear you say net neutral, maybe even a slight positive. Because
and if I could see, I'm sorry to interrupt, but if I'm guilty of doing this too, I think when you're not covering a team day to day and you're trying to cover all the teams or multiple teams, you get in this habit of like grading everyone on the same curve. And the thing that I've tried to do in recent years is like it needs to be relative to your situation. And so with the Pistons, it's like, what was the player? What was the move that makes them a playoff team or puts Cade Cunningham in meaningful games come April? I don't think it was out there. And I think that's an important context when the national discourse is trying to boil things down. They're grading the Pistons like, well, look what the Sixers were able to do or what the Thunder were able to do. And it's like those teams had flexibility, but they were also good to begin with. Why did you pay Tobias Harris so much money? That's the tax you have to pay when you're the Detroit Pistons and you have this track record that you just laid out. So I didn't even mean to interrupt there, but that's something that bugs me, certainly about myself in the past, but I think the national coverage in general, they grade these teams on like the same curve. It's like saying the Milwaukee Bucks didn't do enough this offseason and not understanding like what their actual cap situation was.
No, I think that's perfect. I think fans are going to really love to hear that because they've seen a lot of the ESPN and other places say that the Pistons had a terrible offseason, and a lot of fans feel like, okay, maybe not a great offseason, but straight up terrible. How was that the case? So I think they will love hearing you say that. Coming up, though, I want to talk about the Pistons young core. And I do have a question before we get to the Pistons young core. I will ask you about a comparison between this regime and the past regime. We'll talk about that coming up. You've heard us talk about FanDuel a lot on this podcast. That's America's #1 sportsbook. But we have something a little different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. My NFL fans, my fantasy football fans out there know just how big time that is. I'm going to be taking advantage of it. Then with the YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment. You can cancel anytime. I'll let you guys know how this is going to help me. Fantasy football team, I don't have all Detroit Lions. I have a Miami Dolphin. I have Jalen Waddle. I have a Justin Jefferson. I need to watch these teams out of the market so I know how my team's doing, and this is going to save me. All my NFL fans and fantasy football fans, you guys know how big time that is. Definitely go take advantage of that at FanDuel.com and download America's #1 sportsbook. Again, that's FanDuel.com. Download that today. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. And I don't know if you guys know this, but Spotify, as of I think like 2 weeks ago, they have comments under each episode. So if you guys want to leave some comments on Spotify, if you listen on there, I can come into the comment section and interact with you guys. So you guys can comment on there as well. But before we get to the Pistons young core, I just have a quick question. What is the difference in your opinion so that you've seen so far from Trajan Langdon to a Troy Weaver? Because there has been, I don't believe this, but there is I would say a vocal minority of the Pistons fan base that feels like, okay, well, Trajan's basically trying to sell the Pistons fans on same thing Troy did, which was we're going to improve through the young guys. If we're going to be a good team, it's going to be because of the young guys. We're not going to go get no big star. We're not going to get some big free agent. Tobias is basically a rich man's Bojan. Malik Beasley is a rich man's Alec Burks. And we're just going to do that. And we're going to hope that the young guys carry us again. There's a vocal minority I've seen that feel like, okay, this is about to be another tough season because they did the same thing. Do you think that's similar? Do you think what the Pistons have done is similar to the past regime? Or do you think it's different?
I mean, when you look at the Ron Holland pick, it feels like kind of similar on what the archetype they might be betting on. I think the biggest difference, and I don't know if it's just reading too much into this idea. I know that people believe that Tom Gores was really all for this, but to move off of Monty Williams and get to JB Bickerstaff, even if you don't love the JB Bickerstaff hire in a vacuum, the fact that this front office acted more immediately, it leads me to believe that, okay, there needs to be a wait and see element here. But what you were just talking about with the young players, if Jaden Ivey isn't meshing, or let's say Jaden Ivey's playing relatively well, but you still don't think this is the pathway to go with him next to Cade, it seems like this front office is going to be quicker to act on making those pivotal decisions. And I can't say that for sure, but I think it works with the inverse too, with what you're saying, that the minority believes this front office is too similar. They do deserve a little bit more time to see like, okay, well, which way are they going to lean? But I would argue that kind of what happened this offseason, where it felt like, my criticism of the Tim Hardaway Jr. trade. I hate how much I'm mentioning this transaction, but
it was a bad deal. I'm completely giving up Quinn Grimes for THA's contract, especially like a week after Reggie Jackson's contract got like 4 second-round picks for Denver. I was very frustrated by that deal.
I'm honestly still waiting to find out, does Quentin Grimes not have any cartilage in his knees or something that we don't know about? But at least I think the silver lining is they acted quickly. That was a move that they made, and it was decisive, and it doesn't feel like this front office is equivocating between two different existences. You might not be comfortable with their timeline, but I do think there's a clear-cut timeline set out. And I also believe that even if you don't want to frame it as benefit of the doubt, at least I'll come back to give them a little bit of time, because you are inheriting a situation where so much of what's in place, when you look at the most important players on this team, are not your guys. You had to come in, and I believe it was a no-brainer decision, but you just had to max out Cade Cunningham, who was not someone that you drafted. And so, yes, you don't take the job if you don't view him as the tentpole player around whom you structure everything. But they haven't had enough time to leave an imprint on this organization. And so I do believe, though, that the trace elements of what they've done suggest to me that it wouldn't shock me if they make some, let's call them awkward decisions at the trade deadline with regard to the young players who are not Cade Cunningham, obviously.
Yeah, I'm under that understanding with this team that they'll wait and see how this goes around the trade deadline season, maybe January. They'll see how it goes. And then if things aren't going good, if there's reason to believe they want to move on from one of the young guys, I think that will be the time they do. But let's get to the young guys now. So the Pistons have, a deep young core, if you want to go by just numbers. We'll see how you feel about them talent-wise. But they have Cade, Ausar Thompson, Jalen Duren, Jaden Ivey, Ron Holland, Marcus Sasser, Isaiah Stewart. So they have a lot of these 23 and under guys. I don't know if anyone can sit here and say after this past season and try to say that they're on the same level as a Houston Rockets young core or Orlando Magic's young core. Last year, that was the argument I was making. That, hey, they're all on the same trajectory. They're all going to be good around the same time. This is the rivalry you're going to see across this level of teams. The Jalen Green and Cade, the Cade and Paolo. This is going to be the rivalry. Then this past season happened, and those teams went up, and the Pistons crashed down. So after this past season, I feel like before this past season, a lot of people were, I would say, pretty high on the Pistons young core. I don't know where you stood on it exactly, but overall, I feel like the national commentary on the team was, okay, yeah, they have a good young core. They'll rise soon. And then this past season happened. I feel like, for good reason, a lot of people are not as high on the young core. Where do you think the Pistons young core is at right now?
I don't think my feelings have changed a lot from last year, where I like most of their guys, I would say, just in a vacuum. I struggle to see how you can get to lineups or situations where more than two of them complement one another. And I think that gets even, last season, we're talking about that in the context of Jalen Duren, Cade Cunningham, Ausar Thompson, and Jaden Ivey. Ron Holland just complicates that even more because of what his limitations are. I will say the only individual player Jalen Duren kind of confuses the heck out of me still, but I remain relatively high on is Jaden Ivey's the only player, if I had to pick, that I'm just out on, that I don't necessarily see the fit as clear as I guess some others do with this team. But I also recognize his opportunity last year, it was not perfect with whatever was going on with Monty Williams, but behind the scenes. So I think a healthy dose of skepticism with it is where you should be at. No, it's not on the level of the Rockets, right? Look what the Rockets did last year. Even Amen Thompson coming in midstream after that injury and just playing so well and figuring out how to score off the ball. You want to see more development from specifically the non-Cade guys. And I think when you look at Ausar Thompson and Jalen Duren specifically, even Jaden Ivey, the extra spacing, I think, is just going to give us so more information on not just how these guys operate in a vacuum, but how they can operate alongside one another. I still just wonder, is JB Bickerstaff going to be too cautious when it comes to lineups to where, we're never going to see Ron Holland or Ausar Thompson play together, even see what that looks like, and let alone have them play when Jalen Duren's the big. And as of right now, I just don't see, I mentioned at the top of this little rant, is getting to a point where you feel like more than two of them in any given lineup complement one another. It feels like it's tough right now, but it's easy to say that when we haven't scaled forward and seen, okay, well, how do these guys develop?
So I just want all my listeners to know. So Dan, you don't know about this, but my listeners have been getting very angry about Jaden Ivey criticism, because I'll go out and say I'm also pretty out on Ivey. I just want all my listeners to know I did not tell Dan to say that about Jaden Ivey. I did not know that Dan was out on Jaden Ivey before I started. This was not on purpose. I did not purposely try to re-engage with the Jay and Ivy stuff. So I just want everyone to know I did not do this on purpose. I had no clue. Okay, I had no clue. But second,
is it unfair to? I mean, he's just been so erratic on the offensive end, and like, do we really believe like this is just an issue of opportunity and spacing? And if that's what you honestly believe, then I feel like the first 15 to 20 games of this season are going to be super telltale then of the direction that his career, or at least fit with this team, is headed in.
All I can say to you is I agree, because I'm not trying to continue to make people feel like I'm just continuing to pile and pile on. But I completely agree with your sentiment. There's something that you mentioned in your response, and it's something that I've been trying to talk about every now and then and hint at. But again, talking about it kind of like strips hope from fans. I get it. So I try not to go too crazy into it. But you brought it up, so I have to ask you. There's been a lot of talk about how, you like the player individually. Like each one of these prospects as an individual prospect, sure, like they're cool. Like I love Ausar. I'm very high on Ausar Thompson. I thought he was the clear pick at 5. I'm happy they did it. I love Ausar. But like you said, a lot of these guys, is there ever a scenario where we realistically believe where you can run a lineup with all 5 of them? Like, I would say probably not. Like, realistically, like, most hopeful, yeah. But realistically, it's tough to see. You even mentioned playing more than 2 of them together and playing a Jalen Duren and Ausar Thompson lineup together. Is that even possible? Now, we've talked about this a lot in the podcast. I've looked at the stats. There is after they made the trade for Simone Fontecchio, there is a very limited sample. So who knows? But a very limited sample of 132 minutes when it was Cade, Simone Fontecchio, Ausar Thompson, and Jalen Duren. They were a plus 4.0 net rating, but that was more so to do with their defense being so good. I wonder if that suggests if you have enough spacing around Ausar and Jalen Duren, can you make it work because of how good Ausar is already defensively? I think we'll see if that's the case this year. But overall, the question I'm getting to is, a lot of people feel like, okay, well, at this point, they don't need to be able to play together. Just play them in different lineups. And whereas I'm probably more on the side of, that maybe is a short-term solution. If you are already in the belief of, yeah, I like these guys and we'll play them differently right now. If you already believe like in 2 to 3 years, you can't see them playing together, is it worth keeping all of them? Like, where do you stand on that? Because that's the question I'm asking myself over and over and over again. I get why fans may not like to, have that discussion because, like I said, it does strip some hope. But like, I feel like that is actually not feel like I know that's a conversation the front office is having throughout the offseason. It's one that we'll be having during the season. So where do you stand on that?
I would agree with what you said on the latter, where if you can't envision a scenario, and I undershot when I said 2 because I just wasn't factoring in Cade, because like Cade fits to me with everybody. So it's, can you get to a point where more than 2 of Duren, Ausar Thompson, Ron Holland, and Jay and Ivy can be on the court together? If you don't think you can get to that point, then I don't okay. In the interim, if you're trying to stagger lineups and see what some of these guys can do on the ball versus off of it, and that's a way to delineate touches better, I understand it. But you laid it out. You have all this draft equity invested in these guys who are eventually going to get more expensive if they are good, or you're going to at least have to figure out how much you want to pay them. What's the point of viewing them through the lens of like, oh, we could just make them live completely separate existences? That's how you get to the Zion Williamson, Brandon Ingram dynamic in New Orleans, where it's like, okay, those 2 players are really good, but even when they're playing together, they're not playing together. They just live these separate existences. And so I think the big thing will be is that you probably need, Cade and Jalen Duren. Those are like kind of just easy parts to move around with anyone. You probably need 2 of Ausar Thompson, Ron Holland, and Jaden Ivey to develop into a consistent perimeter threat for it to work in the macro. And I'm not even necessarily saying one of those dudes has to be a good 3-point shooter. That's just, if that's not going to happen, then I don't really know what the vision is. But like when you're looking at Ausar Thompson or Ron Holland, like we saw a little bit of it with Ausar, not too efficient, but like if he can just get up some floaters, or we saw him take some turnarounds last year, like those are just counters and additions and layers that can help you fit in to the larger context of the team. If you can get to a point where like you're using Ausar Thompson even more as a screener and making him make plays because there's actual space in a short roll, and he's able to do that more often, there are things that you can do, and I would be hopeful for it. But like as of right now, Jaden Ivey, Ausar Thompson, and Ron Holland, I know a lot of people believe that Ron Holland can develop into a good jump shooter. But like those 3 right now, even with Simone Fontecchio there, even if Cade Cunningham's there, even if you have Isaiah Stewart at the 5 instead of Duren and you're leaning on his floor spacing, I just really struggle to see how those 3 can help you field a better than league average offense. I mean, defensively, Ron Holland and Ausar Thompson are going to ruin people's lives. That'd be fantastic to watch. But the offense, to me, with this core, how they complement one another is the bigger question.
Yeah, I can look, like I said, I don't like to strip hope away, so we'll see if it can happen. But I completely that's the page I've been on. And I'm really interested to hear how people outside Detroit feel about that, because eventually Ivy and Duran's contract situation's coming up. You just paid Cade. You're getting to this time where decisions need to be made. And I know people like getting attached to players, but you're kind of entering decision time. You're probably going to enter decision time by the trade deadline. So it's we'll see what happens, but I just wanted to see where you stood on that. Coming up, I did want to ask you one quick thing about your last point you just made concerning Ron Holland and Ausar Thompson, and then we'll get into what does Cade have to do this year to really secure himself in that he's next. He's coming up tier. We'll talk about that coming up. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. There's another great way to support the podcast. So Dan, real quickly before we get to Cade, I did want to ask you. You mentioned how Ausar could have these counters of this turnaround shot, floaters, potentially using them in the short roll. I just wanted real quickly to ask about this because I'm someone who's extremely high in Ausar. I feel like if you were going to draft Ausar at the 5 position, the only reason why you draft him there is if you believe he can take some of that playmaking duties he did at OTE, and he'll eventually become a secondary playmaker. He'll eventually be a secondary ball handler. If you don't believe that he has that, then he's not a top 5 level prospect, in my opinion. So they took him 5. Do you believe if he adds, if he brings some of that point guard duties that he did at OTE, his handle was loose this past year. If you think if he improves his handling, do you think him being a secondary playmaker helps with the spacing a little bit more? I don't know if, his brother, like you mentioned, was used in the short roll. He was used in the dunker spot. But I don't think that that's where you want a man to eventually be. I think that's something like a short-term solution to spacing. I think of that, it's kind of the same thing with Ausar. A lot of people focus on his three-point shooting. I think that if he improves his ball handling and gets to a point where you trust him running weak side action, you trust him running DHOs, you trust him running pick and rolls, and you have Cade off ball, that somewhat helps with the spacing as well. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I would strongly agree and just add that even with the handle questions, he's already kind of shown that he could be that level of playmaker to me. If you even just look, it was more look at his passing off of drives and just the live dribble, even if you're not happy with the handle, the decision-making and the vision, it's already there to me. And so he's a perfect instance where, okay, if you have him and you want a big on the court and Jalen Duren, you have Cade. If you can make sure that there are another 2 shooters on the court at all times, that's going to give him the space to do all sorts of stuff, get to the basket even more. So I firmly agree with your view of it, but I would even take it a step further where based off just what we saw last season, I think he's going to be that player if he's in the right environment. And so it comes down to how willing are the Pistons or able are they to kind of tailor it to the limitations of his game that quite frankly might always exist. But look, we've seen this isn't a perfect analog, but look at the way that Denver uses Aaron Gordon a lot of the time. And that's not a team that gets up a lot of threes to begin with, but they have the spacing, they have the off-ball movement to capitalize on basically everybody. And so I view Ausar Thompson as a similar type of player. Yeah, okay, maybe he gets to a point where he's taking 1 or 2 3-point attempts per game, but the value in Aaron Gordon on offense has never once lied in his shooting. And I think as of right now, based off what I've seen from Ausar and knowing what we saw from Aaron Gordon, even in Orlando when he had the ball a bunch, that's someone who is probably already a better passer than Aaron Gordon. And that might overstate it, but his ceiling as a playmaker is going to be higher than Aaron Gordon. So if the Nuggets can figure it out, you can figure out a way to do it with Ausar Thompson for sure to me.
No, I will completely back that up. I think Ausar is a next level passer than Aaron Gordon. I think his process, I love Aaron Gordon. That archetype of player is my favorite player, as I think a lot of listeners know. But I think Ausar is just a next level player, passer, a next level playmaker. I think Aaron Gordon's a really good processor. I think Ausar might be a tier above that as a processor, especially when it comes to playmaking and making next level reads with the ball off a live dribble. And I also think that Aaron Gordon is a crazy athlete. I think the Thompson twins are 1 percentile.
Nuclear.
I just think that he could be a supercharged version of Aaron Gordon. But we'll move on to Cade now. I'm glad to hear that you like Ausar so much, because I think the Thompson twins are going to be superstars, dude.
There are receipts, though, that I said he was going to be like a really good jump shooter from when they first drafted. I was looking at it, and it feels like somehow it got worse.
I did the same thing. I did the same thing.
It's like, I said this to Laz Jackson when we were recording our Pistons Look Ahead at Hardwood Knocks. It's like buffering internet sometimes, like when he's trying to get that thing off. And so that might be a miss on my part, but he still seems like he's going to be a really good player.
I'll share that miss with you. I watched all of his OTE tape. He was shooting from the three-point line, the NBA three line at OTE. At the end of the season, he was taking off the dribble threes, step back threes, and hitting them. Like, he wasn't hitting them at like 40%. He was like a 29, 30% three-point shooter there. But you wouldn't think that he would be, off self-created looks, then come to the NBA and be 15% until February. Right. I couldn't believe it. I was like, what happened? But I expect him, like, at the end of the season, he was around 28% over the last, I think, 15, 16 games. I mean, that's a small sample, but that's where I expected him to be around this past year. The 15%, I was just like, I did not see that coming at all. But we'll see what happens.
Look, 28% might be the bar. Like, Franz Wagner just shot that, and Magic fans are telling me like he's a good jump shooter, even though it's declined year over year. So, I mean,
if he can get the 28, 29, I think everyone would take that as a win. I'm not gonna lie, but 15% was that bad. That's just how bad that was. All right, let's get to Cade. I am extremely high on Cade. Like, I think Cade has, like, I don't even want to say what his potential. I think his ceiling is. Like, I think his ceiling is next level. I think he can be a superstar. Easy all NBA every year. Kind of, like, that's how high I am on Cade. But obviously, he hasn't gotten a lot of credit and a lot of hype since being drafted, because the team's success has been terrible. Like, he hasn't won. The team's been really bad. But this past season, I think him playing how he played this past year with the situation he had is more impressive if he played that way with a good team around him. Like, I think it's more impressive that he was able to do what he did this past year, have the efficiency improvement that he had with the incredible lack of spacing, with Monty as head coach, what he was doing, like, with everything that was going on, the fact he was still able to have these type of improvements, I think is more impressive than anything else. So I think he's on his way to being a superstar. I think he's going to be a star. But despite that, a lot of people outside Detroit don't really talk about Cade a lot. Cade doesn't really get brought up. He was a former number 1 overall pick that doesn't really get talked about. What do you think? First of all, where do you stand on Cade? Are you lower, higher on him than me? Around, like, where are you at? And then what do you think Cade has to do this year? Not to be, like, I guess, considered a superstar, but like to be considered, when people are doing these 24 and under lists, he's towards the top. Like, he's not someone that's like, oh, well, he had that potential, but we haven't really seen it. Like, what does he have to do this year individually? Is it just team success, or is there something he can do individually to really be considered one of those guys?
Yeah. So with regards to where I land on him, I just like, this is going to be an all NBA guy. And so it's like, I like view that as you will, but like, even when you're looking at his draft class and maybe some of those guys coming out of the gate and having better years and being on better teams at points has overshadowed. I also think, and we're seeing this a little bit with John Morant, where when it comes to the way we evaluate NBA players, absence seems to make the heart grow negative. And so because Cade dealt with all those injuries, and then you factor that in with, okay, the Pistons haven't been great. How many people are watching them past December into the new year at this point? You're just not seeing as much as Cade as some of these other guys that have been on more relevant teams, which really just isn't fair. I would view last season the same way that you did, with what he was able to accomplish. Now, the other issue with Cade too is that this happens with other players. It seems like something that happens in the first 15 or 20 games of the season, if people will latch onto that and make it the narrative or their evaluation for the rest of the year. And so Cade has those turnover issues to start the season. He was able to clean those up as the year went on, but like, that wasn't talked about at all. It was only, oh, look at all the turnover issues he had. And they're framing it as an entire season issue when it was really, okay, like the first quarter of the season or whatever it is. I have seen enough growth from him to make me believe that if you put him in an environment with better spacing, we keep coming back to that, you're going to see one of the most dynamic offensive players in the league. And we already saw it last year. He has the step back going. Would I like to see him exchange some of those mid-range looks for more looks at the basket? It seems like he should be strong enough to finish better around the basket too. Yeah, I'd love it. But let's see what that looks like, where like they're going to put him in lineups where there's 3 shooters on the court this year. Like, that's a big deal. That should help open up the room for him. And so you combine that with his size, the vision he clearly has, like there's just not a pass in theory that he can't make. that he was able to put up the numbers, especially over, the last 50 or whatever games it was of the season. That's a big deal. And when I look at him, there's no reason like this. If you told me he just averaged like 28 points with 60% true shooting or better this year, like I'm just going to believe it. Like I think he's that dude, and he's just been overshadowed by what's going on with Detroit. And then I really do think like all that time he missed with injury, that certainly did halt his development and obviously people's exposure to him.
So I completely agree with all that. I think that, just to hit on something you said about like his draft class, like other players that get talked about a lot, and I'm not making you latch on to this take, so I want everyone to know that this is Kuka Hill's take, not Dan's. No one has to go after Dan. But like you look at Scotty Barnes, he went to a team that just won the championship that still had a lot of those core guys around him, that he wasn't asked to be immediately the best player. Franz Wagner, they have Paolo, they have a legit good team over there in Orlando. Jalen Green, I don't even think people consider him like the top prospect on Houston anymore. Maybe not even top 2.
Only from March 1st on, and then he's the top prospect. Yeah.
Right, there you go. Yes, exactly. So like you see all these other situations, and you see the Pistons just like really have done nothing around Cade at all to like put a team around him. I don't know if there's been another number 1 overall pick that just through 3 years so far has literally had nothing done to like put a good team. It actually got worse. Like I just don't think it happened. So I do think Cade's kind of worn the brunt of that, and it kind of, like you said, it's kind of unfair, especially the whole first 15 games thing. That's something I really latched onto a lot this past season on the podcast over the last 2 months of the year. Everyone talking about his turnovers. I'm like, guys, he was averaging like 5.2 the first 15 games, and ever since then he's averaging like 2.9. Like, so it's averaging out. He's cleaned it up. It just was so bad the first 15 games. Like it's going to end up at like 3.3, I think it was, whatever. But I agree with everything you said. What I want to ask is this, and then we'll wrap up the podcast. Do you feel like, and maybe I'm too, I'll publicly admit it, I'm really close with his trainer. I've had his brother on the podcast. I'm cool. I'm really close with, I like Cade a lot. I think Cade's going to be amazing, and I'm cool with his guys. So maybe I have a little, colored glasses on. But do you feel like that at this point, like the Pistons should feel a level of, like, we have to be good. Like, we have to put a good team around this guy now. Like, we've paid him. He played this well this past year. Like, we can't keep playing around with this. Like, we have to try to put something around him. Because I think that probably was where, like, I was coming from this offseason, where I was like, hey, need to make some moves. That probably was where I was coming from, where the root of it was. Do you think there's anything to that? Do you think they need to have like a faster timer going on? Like, hey, we got to hurry this up, or no?
I mean, they can't win 14 games. Like, that's just like that's a thing that can't happen. But I think they did their part by maxing him out when they did, because I'm a big advocate. Whether people think, I'm open to the discussion that they think restricted free agency should not exist. As long as it does exist, I don't understand why teams don't use it. Like the Franz Wagner situation of a Magic team that's really good, could maybe have some flexibility next year, but they decided to just take his cap hold and it skyrockets, I think, by 15 plus million.
Well, this is kind of what Houston's doing, right? With Sengun. They're waiting to
look what Philly did with Tyrese Maxey. That offseason in Philly does not happen without Tyrese Maxey's cooperation. Now, the Pistons can have a ton of flexibility, but because they're either not good enough, because you don't want to, risk turning Cade off because you have been so bad, I understand why you max him out now. That's not one, like I found the Franz Wagner one curious. Evan Mobley, no. The Cavs don't have cap space. Go ahead and do it. The Pistons, you could argue, why not prioritize that flexibility? You locked him down for 5 years, and you gave him that early when, relative to your flexibility, maybe it didn't behoove you to do that. Now, his cap hold was going to be so high as the number 1 overall pick, it didn't matter too much. You have him for 5 years. I think it's more important to play the long game, make sure he understands what you're doing, because what's going to happen when you try and accelerate timelines, if you're not good enough to that point, I mentioned them already, you become the Chicago Bulls, you become the Hornets before this current regime that was there. You have to be in a situation where look at what Cleveland did with Donovan Mitchell. Like, that was the right time to strike. And even then they were very clear about, yes, we have Donovan Mitchell, but we're not expecting to be a contender right away. And so I don't think they should feel pressure to win. And if he's applying pressure to them, he's under contract for really another 6 seasons. He's under team control. And so it's just like, he's going to have to sit tight there, and you want to communicate with him. And yes, you want to get better. We can't, if you and I are talking 2 years, 3 years down the line and the Pistons have not really improved, it's a different discussion. But when you strive to accelerate, when you're at a baseline as low as the Pistons are working off right now, I honestly, most of the time, I would say 90% of the time, that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and I completely get that. And there's an example I bring up on the podcast too. The Atlanta Hawks a few years ago, like they went all in and used up all their assets, used up all their cap space to really go all in with Trey. And it worked for 1 year. They got to the conference finals. They had that successful year, but you see that they've been trying to dig themselves out of that since then, and they haven't really been able to build that team. So that's an example I bring up on the pod all the time. I think it's going to be an interesting balance act because to win 14 games, man, and 28 game losing streak, it's just like, dude, like that's next level bad. I don't know how many people can survive that. But like I do understand that you don't want to start getting rid of all your assets when it's not time yet. I just think that it's going to be an interesting balance act. I really do think that this deadline is going to be very interesting for the Pistons. I don't know which way they're going to go, but I think there's certainly going to be a way they take that involves a couple moves being made. I don't know what's going to happen, but
can I ask you a quick question then? If
go ahead.
If the Pistons are operating from a position of we want to be aggressive and upgrade the roster, you could pick either any player or archetype that they would have to go all in. Like, what is the ideal archetype or ideal player to slot next to Cade to make you feel like, okay, this thing is ready to really take off?
A wing scorer. So I'll just let you in a little bit. So I think of Ausar as the future number 2 for the Pistons. Like I know they're going to play him at like probably the 3, and they probably will throw him at the 4 sometimes just to try to use him in the short role and play him as a power forward to make up for the spacing. I don't think they're going to be too creative with it. That's a whole topic for another day. But I view Ausar as the secondary playmaker of the future for the Pistons, and he'll be the 2 that guards the best teams player. And he's so good on the glass as a guard, as a wing, that you can kind of get away with it. And he's going to like really make you a great So I think Ausar is going to be the future too. I think what they really need is like a 3 or 4 that can just flat out score the ball and can help alleviate some of that scoring pressure off of Cade, which is why there was a name this offseason that I was interested in. And I understand the skepticism and I get I somewhat understand the fit conversation about it, but like I was interested in the Pistons going after Brandon Ingram. I thought he would have been something good with Cade, really help him out. I know BI's kind of overrated a little bit as a playmaker, but I think he is one. He had a few years when he actually took threes, like 4 or 5, and he shot well and then just stopped for some reason the last 3 years. I don't know why. I know that's part of the reason why New Orleans is trying to move on. But either way, my point is, like an archetype like that, I think is what they should be trying to go after.
I mean, if you can get someone like that without having to mortgage yourself to the hilt in the future, but if you believe that Ausar Thompson is that guy, you're really kind of looking for like your like third option of the future. And like someone like Brandon Ingram's not going to settle into it. He couldn't even fit in as a number 2, really. It's like you're almost looking for your Mikal Bridges type deal, and you kind of just saw what it cost to get him. And it's like the Pistons just aren't at a point where they can, I personally, justify giving that outlay. It helps them in a sense that what you're framing is they don't need to go out and get like this massive star. But then, like, we've kind of seen what the cost of these non-massive stars are anyway. So,
all right, so we'll wrap it up here. I want your prediction here. Do you think the Pistons at the deadline, we'll wrap it here, do you think at the deadline, in your opinion, you'll see young players moved on from? Or do you think you'll see them either stay pat or add other players to the young core?
I think they're going to end up doing both. To where if you had to ask me if all 5 of these guys, well, we'll say 4, just because we know Cade's going to be on the roster. As someone who just roots for chaos, I'm going to say no, that those other 4, not all 4 of them are going to be on past the trade deadline. And they probably will make a move that it's not going to elevate them into the playoff conversation, but it's someone who's maybe not super young, or it's not someone that you're playing the super long game with. It's they help us now. And it's not even about adding wins to the tally. It's about how do we optimize the talents that are going to be here long term. And so I think they make, we kind of saw that with Simone Fontecchio. And I think it's another move like that, but probably for a player who, like, in a vacuum is just better or more polarizing than Simone Fontecchio.
All right, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you, Dan, for coming on, man. I really appreciate this. This is a lot of fun. I think everyone's going to enjoy this. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Free and available on all your podcast platforms. Hit that subscribe button to the YouTube channel. Leave us a 5-star review, whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. I'm Koo. That's Dan. You can follow him on Twitter at Dan Favale. Until next time, I'll see you guys later. Stay safe out there. Until next time, peace out.